It's time for the Bible. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, God, blast them like spot. Ghost, yes, friends, it's time for the Bible. Interpretation, Star, Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's time for the Bible Geek yet again, or already, depending on your viewpoint. Thought I'd get rid of... What does Chris Kringle say in Miracle on 34th Street? My brother just told me that he thought I was playing the role in a local theater production of it. He says, let's just take care of some of these kiddies first. Well, let's do that. This is from Sean in Ontario, Canada, he says. I'm very interested in the beginnings of the Jewish religion and its origins from Canaanite polytheism. El, Elyon, Asheroth, Baal, etc. I've heard you mention on the podcast that Yahweh derived from this pantheon, and I was wondering if you could go into further detail on the subject as well as a list of any suggested readings, Yeah, it is really fascinating. There are various indications in the Old Testament that you're dealing with gods, and there's like the Garden of Eden story where God, Yahweh Elohim, is clearly talking to his divine colleagues. Behold, their eyes are open. They're like one of us. Let's get them out of here. Who's he talking to? Or in the priestly creation account, let us make man in our image. Thus he made them male and female, which certainly seems to mean that they're gods and goddesses, just like in the Babylonian creation account, the Enuma Elish, which the priestly account kind of resembles. There are names, like it says Zadok, or righteousness, and Shalom, peace, will kiss in one of the Psalms. That's apparently a god and goddess in the ancient Jerusalemite religion. The God El Elyon, the Most High God, that certainly implies that there are other gods. And who are they? Well, the sons of God, the Beni Elohim in the Psalms and so forth, and in Genesis when the sons of God mate with mortal women. Yahweh is apparently one of the 70 sons of God, whose number determined how many nations El Elyon would divide the human race into. Deuteronomy 32, when he set the boundaries of the nations, he did so according to the number of the sons of Elohim, and Yahweh's portion was Jacob. So Yahweh was assigned to Israel. Now there were other gods they knew of that were properly the gods of other countries, peoples like Baal and Moloch and so forth, but they didn't want you to worship them. But on the other hand, your own pantheon was pretty much the same. Like from everything we read in ancient Middle Eastern texts, Baal Hadad was pretty much the same thing as Yahweh, the thunder god, the sky god who rides a chariot drawn by personified clouds and as his steeds and all that. Yahweh and Asherah were shown side by side in a bas-relief from the Jewish temple in Leontopolis, I believe it was, in Egypt. The inscriptions from that temple, believe it or not, there was one down there, mention several deities alongside Yahweh. There's a couple of Baal inscriptions that I guess in the Ugaritic texts, Canaanite texts, which simply identify Yahweh and Baal, where El, same name for the chief god, El says of Baal, my son is Yah, and on it goes. It's very difficult to suppress this and pretend that something else is going on. I mean, if somebody says, and no apologist would say this, but if some of them tried the extreme expedient of saying, well, they are the gods, they're mentioned neutrally or approvingly, but that just shows the syncretistic corruption of the Israelite faith. What, on the part of the Bible writers? They're not going to go that far. But it does appear that monotheism was pretty late development, and I mean by that it seems to show up clearly for the first time in Jeremiah and the second Isaiah, and that's pretty late, even if you accept the traditional dates, which I sort of don't. I think they're later, and that is younger. Hosea. There's this astonishing thing where Hosea speaks in the name of God, and he says, "You will no longer call me my Baal, but rather my husband." Well, Baal means Lord or Master, but it's a little hard to imagine that that's not a reference to the Hebrew God, meaning that some people thought he was the same as Baal. Okay, now, reading suggestions. There are a few, well, probably loads and loads, but let me just recommend 3 books here. One is Mark S. Smith, The Early History of God, subtitled Yahweh and the Other Deities in Ancient Israel. That's pretty straightforward. That's Mark S. Smith, The Early History of God, Yahweh and Other Deities in Ancient Israel. Then, my favorite is Margaret Barker's The Great Angel, a study of Israel's second God. And another one by Avigdor Shinan and Yair Zakovich. Let me just spell those out. The first author, Avigdor Shinan. The second author, Yair and Zakovitch. Okay, and it's called From Gods to God, How the Bible Debunked, Suppressed, or Changed Ancient Myths and Legends. So I think that'd be a lot of good homework you would find very fascinating. Okay, this from Dr. Stormbringer, who requests an ancient Samaritan accent. I'd have to channel one of them, but I'll give it my best shot. Geek the one, given the emphasis in various places in the Bible on the meaning of names, it seems to me the significance of the meaning of Adam as man or mankind and Eve as mother of all living is often overlooked and perhaps obscured in most English translations. In your view, do these archetypal names give us any indication that they were intended as mythic figures? Mother of all living even seems to have divine connotations. Are there any parallels or name similarities between Eve and ancient Near Eastern goddesses? Oh, ain't it the truth? Some more question, but let me pause there. Yeah, the Mother of All Living was a title of Oruru, who appears in the Gilgamesh epic and elsewhere. She's the one that creates Enkidu to fight Gilgamesh. She was the Mother of All Living, and actually these various mother gods, of which there are several in Asia Minor and the Middle East, they're all sort of equivalent to one another, just like all the goddesses in the Olympian pantheon are really pretty much aspects of one another. But even down to the name Eve or Heba or Hebe, she appears as I think one of the wives of Hercules, and also I believe is a Hittite goddess who rides a lion, and so that name is certainly connotative of a deity. We hear of a king in the Bible Obed-Heba, which means servant of Eve, implying a worshiper of Eve. So yeah, she's like Pandora, which probably originally denoted all gifts. That she was the creatrix. So you bet Eve is a goddess. And Adam, yeah, man or mankind. In fact, I think that in the second chapter of Genesis, you're not supposed to be reading those two terms as proper names at all. It should be the man and the woman until chapter 3, when suddenly they're intended to mean names, like Adam knew his wife. This is after it says he named her Eve at the end of chapter 3. At the beginning of chapter 4, it becomes a name. Adam knew his wife, and she brought forth Cain. So it eventually becomes a name. But anyway, my translation of the Enuma Elish which means when on high, has Marduk declaring, I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Though context indicates he is actually creating a group of savages named Man, which would seem to parallel Adam as man. Is there anything you can say on the development in Jewish or early Christian thought about the identification of Adam as an archetypal myth versus a historical individual? Does Paul's language in the epistles indicate he thought of Adam as an historical individual, and would that be common in first century Judaism? I think from what sources we have in first century Judaism that sure, by that time Jews believed there had been an original historical Adam, but there remained in Jewish awareness the notion that Adam was a corporate entity, the idea of the guff, that the cosmic Adam was the treasury of souls, that all were contained in him, and that, if you saw the real good movie, The Seventh Sign, not Bergman's The Seventh Seal, but The Seventh Sign, with Jürgen Prochnow and Demi Moore and others, really interesting flick. The world is about to end because the guff is nearly empty. There are no more souls to be born. Fascinating. That's part of this cosmic Adam thing. If you look at Zoroastrian myth, Gaiomard was the primal man who was split into male and female, and thus he was the parent of the whole human race. Well, that's another way of saying the primal man is the archetypal man who somehow includes all humans within himself. The Greek makes an interesting distinction. It has a single word for human being, anthropos, meaning neither male nor female, just human, and then aner and gune for male and female, same words for husband and wife. In Hebrew, same thing. Adam means human being, period. But Ish and Isha mean male and female. And it says that in chapter 2, God created the Adam. But once he differentiates the wife, he says, the man says, she shall be called Isha, for she was taken out of Ish. And so, different word even. I mean, the author himself distinguishes the terms for us. And, I think, here's another wacky theory of mine, that the original first man and collective man in Hebrew mythology was Enosh, whose name means man, as in Bar Enosh, the son of man. And that he kind of got put in the shade when the Edomite first man, Edom, from whom there tribe was named and all that, was borrowed by Israelites. And they just changed the consonants. As you know, the consonants were not stable in those words in the ancient languages. They just had roots of 3 consonants that could be mixed up and then punctuated with different vowels, and there would be related terms, etc. Well, Edom and Adam seem to be the same, and so there's a God who becomes human, and so yeah, there's certainly divine echoes there. Paul, in at least whoever wrote Romans and 1 Corinthians, certainly seems to believe in an individual that he calls Adam. I'm sure there was no innovation, obviously. There are plenty of Jews that believe that. But his actions influence the whole human race and kind of include the whole human race, which is where you get original sin, right? When Adam sinned, through the one man's act of disobedience, the many were made sinners, etc. And then they all sinned too. But death came into the world through the action of this one guy. Because, they're kind of all in him somehow. And then in 1 Corinthians, as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. And Christ is called the last Adam, in the sense, as I like to translate it, the Adam at the end of time. Sort of makes Edmund Hamilton into a biblical writer, but what the heck? I think that's the point. The eschatological Adam. And there, it's absolutely clear that Christ is a collective entity. And baptized Christians become part of the body of Christ. Well, that's mysticism. It's a good comparison of Jewish Kabbalistic notions of the cosmic Adam and the language of the New Testament epistles is found in a fascinating little book by Hugh Schoenfield, Schonfield, called Those Incredible Christians. A really very interesting book. Okay, thanks, Doc. And who's next? To quote Eva Galley, Paul Karpov's. I can't quite read this. The letters in my font are rubbing up against each other. Karpovsmina, I think. The Acts of the Apostles. Okay. Dear Dr. Professor, late for dinner. Hey, I told you to call me anything but late for dinner. Anyway, I have 3 questions, one for each of the 3 members of the hypostatic geeky trinity. First, for the father, Dr. Price, I have a question about money. I've never been big on the whole donation thing. There's some suggestions, for donations for the Geek, let's see. And it has to do with Ustream and all that I know nothing about. Tell you what, I will pass this on to John Felix, who knows all about that stuff. Next, for the Sun Geek. I'm new to this whole Jesus thing, but so far something that has stuck out was Jesus' beef with the Pharisees. What about Pharisaic Judaism is so at odds with the teachings of pseudo-Jesus? The Gospels won't shut up about the Pharisees, but hardly mention the Sadducees or Essenes. I know it's been suggested that perhaps the proto-Christians were an offshoot of Essenism, so maybe that part isn't such a mystery, but why no Sadducees? This is an interesting one because Jesus is sometimes shown as having arguments with the Pharisees over matters where the positions attributed to the Pharisees in the Gospels do not match the evidence of the Mishnah about what the Pharisees taught. For instance, the Korban thing. Jesus is shown lampooning the idea that you could say to your aged parents, look, Mom, Dad, I know you need money to keep visiting angels here and to get that moving chair built onto the stairway and all that. But I'm afraid I can't oblige you because I'm piously giving that money to the temple treasury. It is korban, devoted. And Jesus says, well, look at this. Isaiah was right about you guys when he said, these people honors me with lip service, but their heart's far distant from me. They set aside the Word of God and prefer the traditions of men, and that's what you're doing all across the board. And he says, look, doesn't the actual Scripture say take care of your father and mother? But you know better. You absolve somebody of having to do that if they're willing to give the money to the temple. Well, apparently somebody thought you could do that, but because Jesus is not the only one on record against it. The Mishnah several times brings that up, and the point is always, look, if somebody makes a rash vow like that, you don't have to stick with it. The important thing to do is to take care of your parents. So were they polemicizing against some kind of super legalistic nuts or TV evangelists or something? I don't know, but it needn't have been a rival legal opinion. It could have just been something that overzealous Jews did from time to time, like you frequently read about old people that give the money. I know this is the shoe on the other foot, but they give the money that they might otherwise have bequeathed to the next generation to so-and-so's cellophane cathedral or whatever, and sometimes the children sue to get the money back. Well, yeah, I mean, people might have been doing that and had brought the question, perhaps the parents cheated out of the money, brought the question to the scribes, but we don't have anybody on record saying, oh yeah, that's right, you can take the money out of the food out of your parents' mouth and donate it to the temple. So Jesus is against that, and the Pharisees are for it, not that we know of. Jesus is healing by divine power on the Sabbath. Were the Pharisees against that? No, the only time that's mentioned is to say it's okay to heal on the Sabbath if you're using divine incantation, healing by word. Well, that's what Jesus is doing. They just mean a practicing physician can't hang out a shingle on the Sabbath and get paid for it, right? So, what are they? It's like whoever came up with this already thought of the Pharisees as a bunch of intolerant villains. Or Jesus is given grief for associating with sinners. Well, a rabbinic tradition about Aaron, which is certainly unhistorical, but it doesn't matter, it's just being used as a fictional good example. He associated with known criminals so that when the next time they were tempted to sin, they'd say, my pal Aaron would really be disappointed in me if I did this. I guess I won't. I mean, is that much different? And Jesus isn't going to the casino or the brothel with these people to whoop it up. He's trying to get them to repent, right? You mean to tell me Pharisees didn't want sinners to repent? It's preposterous, and so on. So they're vilified. They're much like the way the disciples are depicted in the Gospels as utter dunderheads who don't understand anything Jesus says. Well, is that the way they actually were? Well, could be, but they perform a literary function. It's like the evangelist wants to amplify on the saying of Jesus he records, and so he figures, well, I bet I know what's going through the mind of the reader. I think I'm going to have a character say it. And sometimes, forgive, man, how long do you have to do this? So we have the comment in there. Peter says, how many times must I forgive my brother? 7 whole times? And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. So someone has decided to say what Jesus would say. It's like this cliche, what would Jesus do? Well, what would he say? Let's say that he did. course, people are still doing that, right? These church signboards and billboards on the highway, where it says, let's you and me get together before the big game Sunday. Yuck, yuck, right? Come to church before the Super Bowl. Signed, God. Where do they propose to have gotten this? Is there some book of among the prophets that I'm missing that has references to the Super Bowl and such? And I don't think so, right? They just figure, I said it, God believes it, that settles it. I saw one the other day in front of a church. God says, read the Bible. Where does he say this? Again, in somebody's imagination. So they did that in the early church too, and that's why you have idiot disciples and, I suspect, hostile Pharisees to just give Jesus the chance to shine. In fact, when you look at these opinions recorded in the Mishnah, though they're a bit later than Jesus, that's really all you can go on, right? We don't know that that's what the Pharisees of the time thought, but it's the best evidence we've got. And some people like Harvey Falk in a book called Jesus the Pharisee, and another one by Chaim Maccabee with the same title years and years later, they both argue Jesus would have been considered a Pharisee. The debates he had with them are no different than the debates they were constantly having with each other. Just read the Mishnah. Rabbi A says this and Rabbi B says, oh, no, this is the deal. Probably collegial. People might have gotten a bit hot under the collar, but nobody was trying to kill each other over it. And so the story has grown in the telling and yet has a ring of truth. But given what Jesus espouses, he would have been considered a Pharisee. Falk says Pharisees from the house, or that is the school of Shammai. And so it's arguable that that's what's going on there, what the historical basis is, and that, or the sectarian thing, just to bring in the Sadducees, they don't come up that often except implicitly in the trial narratives, because usually the high priests and the controlling interest in the Sanhedrin was Sadducee, because Sadducee apparently is just a variant of the Greek word syndikoi, from which we get syndicate. And the members were syndics, and it just means a council. So a Sadducee would have been probably a wealthy, influential Jewish elder, and who probably stuck with more conservative doctrines. The distinctives of the Pharisees and the Essenes seem to have been borrowed from Persian Zoroastrianism, and the Sadduceic old guard wouldn't go along with this. So they didn't believe in life after death, the resurrection of the dead, hierarchies of angels, and all kinds of stuff. But interestingly, the Pharisees and Jesus are allied against them when it comes to the resurrection in that famous story. Rabbi, about this resurrection thing, and they give him the hypothetical, what about the woman that goes through 7 husbands in her cooking, kills them off one after the other, kind of like in the book of Tobit, and but they're all righteous. She was married to one and then the next, and in this so-called resurrection of yours, what, is she going to be married to all of them? And Jesus says, he slips out of it cleverly and says, no, don't worry, guys. Nobody's going to be married in heaven anymore. Oh, well. But that shows that the Pharisees didn't really mind a little help from Jesus when it came to a common enemy. As the Essenes, right, we don't know exactly who they were, but if they're the same as the Qumran community, they may have been the early Christians, the same thing as the Ebionites. That might explain why the Essenes are never mentioned by name in the Gospels, because they're us, right, the sect of the writer of the Gospels. It's tough to say. I mean, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they call themselves followers of the way. They call themselves the poor, and these are 2 major Jewish Christian titles for themselves. Finally, for the geeky spirit, I know how much you love your comics and graphic novels, but I was wondering if you have ever, or do ever, read foreign comics, that is, manga, a couple of similar words in Japanese, I guess, or others. I don't. But my daughter Victoria is really avid for that stuff, and she just absolutely goes crazy for Dragon Ball Z and Akira, and has various tattoos representing the characters. She's got a figure collection of hundreds of Dragon Ball Z characters. But I've never gotten into that, though one of my favorite superheroes does come from Japanese TV animation in the 60s, and that's Eighth Man. In fact, I've got a little lapel pin of him on right now that Victoria gave me for my birthday. So I'm pretty much sticking to the many different American types, or I have in the past. I don't really buy comics anymore. Some collections of them, but don't really have the money or the space for it. But I certainly do love the old ones: DC, Marvel, Tower, Archie, Charlton, you name it. Great stuff. Thanks, Paulie. And this, a pair of questions from JC in Colorado. I have a couple of non-related questions for you. I'm sure you've discussed this many times, but why are fundamentalists so attached to the King James translation? I understand it is not a particularly good translation when compared with others, but that's the one they fall back to. What was the relationship of this translation to King James I of England, 1566 to 1625? Is the translation dedicated to him in some way? Was there a financial endowment? It seems strange to me after doing a little research on King James. He is said to have been bisexual, if not completely homosexual. I know a lot of Christians would have a mini-stroke if they knew that little factoid. Why would God allow his holy word to be associated with a gay man in this way? Well, why would God allow Hitler to do what he did either, right? So, I mean, that's never, that is too much of a problem all across the board to get too upset about this. We do know, of course, King James had nothing to do with the writing of it, or the translating of it, despite the fact that Muhammad Ali long ago said that he thought King James wrote the Bible, and I'm sure there are plenty that do. I mean, if you know nothing about it, that's not a stupid inference, but it's hard to imagine somebody knowing that much nothing about it. But we do know some of the translators, and they were scholars, and of course this was a revision based on various slightly earlier versions of the Bible, English translations, like Wycliffe's Bible and New Testament anyway, and the Great Bible and the Geneva Bible, which are all still in print. You can get them and read any one of them, and you'll recognize a bunch of phrases, because the committee that did the King James, though they did their own translation, there were a lot of already familiar passages that they thought were accurate enough and were familiar and stylistically effective, and they just carried them over. So it's much like the American Standard Bible and the Revised Standard Bible. They're not totally new translations. They're just revisions of the King James. And one other thing about it, King James apparently had this thing commissioned. He was James II of Scotland, who became James I of England. Let's see. That Bible actually is not a bad translation. It gets some things right, especially with the roles of women here and there, surprisingly, that later translations got wrong, like the fact that Eve and Adam were both present at the tree to be tempted by the snake. You don't have the word with her in more recent translations until very recently, when they got honest about it. In Romans 16, when it mentions a female apostle, Junia, the King James and very recent translations recognize that that had to be a female name. It was not the accusative of the male Junius. The King James had that right, and there are naturally mistakes they made, or debatable renderings and so on, but there are two problems with the King James. One is that the language was somewhat antiquated even in the 17th century when it was done, and of course you know why that is, right? It is dependent on familiar English translations from somewhat earlier time, and people liked it and they didn't want to change it if they didn't have to. So it's somewhat archaic, but it's really archaic today. A lot of words, people don't even know what they mean anymore. They've changed in meaning, so that's a problem, the archaic language, despite its charm. But another one is the King James is based on much more limited textual, that is, manuscript resources. I think they use the Textus Receptus, the Greek text that Erasmus had put together right after the Reformation. And he had only 6 partial Greek manuscripts of the New Testament to work with, and he filled the gaps where he had no original Greek text by retranslating the Latin Vulgate back into the likely Greek original. And since then, there have been thousands of Greek manuscripts and thousands of translations from Latin, Syriac, Georgian, Armenian, you name it, and so it's much easier to weed out secondary material, and that's what modern translations have done, except for the New King James Version, which sticks with the old text. But it's the text and the style that are the real problems in the King James, not inaccuracy per se. So it's still certainly a worthy Bible for many purposes. Let's see. Okay. My second question might be a book idea for you. Clearly, the internet is having a profound effect on religion. We can now easily find others with a similar view of religion. We have more or less a permanent record of what is being said about religion and ready access to all sorts of information, publications, books, debates, forums, etc. I think the information age is going to be the death of religion, except maybe as literature. I don't find any books discussing this topic. What is your view? Is the internet the death knell for organized religion, or does it benefit the pious? It would be a fascinating discussion. Hint, hint, what are your views? I'm not sure if that's going to be the thing that breaks the camel's back, but it is a powerful influence pushing society towards secularism. Josh McDowell, the infamous apologist, was addressing people at an apologetics conference and saying we better do something here on the internet because it's really killing us. Our young people are turning away because they're reading all this atheist stuff online that they never read in book form and had no access to. And yeah, that does seem to be the case from some sort of surveys. Of course, that's not the only reason they're leaving churches in droves, young people. The evangelical opposition to gay marriage is a real killer. That is really causing the conservative churches to hemorrhage young people. They just agree with the rest of the popular culture that that's bigotry. And so they don't want anything to do with it. So these churches are in big trouble in the near future. And the internet does have more to do with that. My friend Ed Suominen, my collaborator on Evolving Out of Eden, he wrote a single book called An Examination of the Pearl, because his old church, the conservative Laestadian Lutherans, a micro sect in Finland and in the United States, he believed in that for a long time, and then finally just could not anymore. And he wrote up a book that is just a very impressive history of that whole movement, as well as an analysis of biblical problems that just don't square with the belief in inspiration and authority. Well, he got in big trouble for having circulated manuscript copies of this book among a few friends of his in the movement. And he eventually just couldn't take it, the whole thing, couldn't stand it, and left. Though he loved it and didn't want to, but he just couldn't live with it anymore. Well, he began to find out that these copies are being passed around, so he published it as a book. And now, like, there's this whole ex-Laestadian Lutheran community online. Now, before, often these people with their questions didn't have anybody that they could raise them with, because suppose they didn't sympathize. Hey, brother so-and-so's a heretic, here's what he told me, and you didn't dare do it. And now you don't have to worry about that. You can no doubt find ex-Mormons, doubting Jehovah's Witnesses, fundamentalists, etc. online and read their testimonies, and that affirms your doubts and helps you reconstruct a new identity. That was never available in the old days of a couple of decades ago. It does seem to me that the modern technology, communication, information is really hurting these churches. And as for the liberal so-called, or should I say formerly mainstream denominations, they tend to be just social clubs. Now, all churches are, and they're supposed to be, and that's a good thing. You need a community of people, right? But often liberal churches are just branches of the Democratic Party, just like there are some fundamentalist churches that are just offshoots of the Republican Party and so on, right? And as people get sick of partisan bickering, I think you're going to see people dropping away from that too. So I think it does have a lot to do with the decline of religion. But, things swing different ways. It looked like religion was going to dry up on the vine in the 60s, and it didn't. But again, things are different from then, too. So it might indeed help finish it off. By the way, the pious do make very capable use of computer technology and the internet. I was trying to verify a quote that I thought came from John Wesley's A Plain Account of Christian Perfection that I read back in the 80s, but I wasn't absolutely sure, so I was looking for it. Well, I don't happen to have the book anymore, but there are various copies of it online to check, right? So, and there are Bible concordances online and all kinds of stuff that ingenious conservative religious folks have used to their and my advantage. I'm mighty glad to have these resources. So it's going on both sides, that's for sure. This is from Sean. Let's see. Accent if... Oh, he's from Ontario. Yeah. Your geekiness, I count from the death of Hezekiah, who did right in the eyes of Yahweh, through the reigns of Manasseh and Ammon, up to the time of Josiah finding the scroll of the Torah. It's 67 years, eh? Are we to believe that the inhabitants of Judah had completely forgotten the Torah in that 67-year period? I know they had reestablished the high places to Baal and a new pole to Asherah during Manasseh's rule, but to be so utterly and completely surprised by finding this scroll and its contents seems like a bit much. 2 Kings 22:13. Go inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah concerning the words of this scroll that was found. For the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us is great, because our ancestors did not listen to the words of this scroll to do according to all that is written concerning us. Or is it through all the good king, good king, and so on throughout the Second Kings that the tradition and adherence to the Torah was lost? Well, I was just writing this in the Chronicles chapter of my work in progress, Holy Fable, the Bible Undistorted by Faith. What you have in Kings and then repeated in Chronicles is this, like you say, a seesaw between reforming kings and getting rid of the high places and the altars of other gods, and then it swings right back after they die. The next king is no good, and he brings all the stuff back, but the one after him reforms it all. What the heck is going on? This is a reflection of the fact that the source materials, whatever they were, that had historical type narratives in them, presuppose that the people did not have the Torah, at least not the priestly code, and Deuteronomy, and that their religion, they didn't know any better than to have various gods or to worship Yahweh on the local high places, the hilltop shrines, and all that stuff. This was traditional Israelite religion, and there were no laws against it. But the compilers of Kings and Chronicles they're trying to seek an ancient pedigree for laws authored much later, after the times they're describing, but pretty recently to them. And so they want to say that the priestly code and the Torah and all that stuff was old enough that everybody should have, or perhaps even did, know of it. But the stories, to be used at all, presupposed that no, Israelite religion was not like that. But then, how could that be if God had really given this stuff to Moses way back there? Well, they had to say, well, they sort of did know what they should do, but didn't care, or they forgot, or they were misled by their kings who decided to hell with it, I'm worshiping idols. But then, since again, after Hezekiah or Josiah or Asa or whoever, the stories presupposed a pre-Torah version of the story. To get back to that, they had to say that the people apostatized and the kings backslid, and it was back to the usual idolatry. But how could they completely forget it? So was another reforming king. But then, the next stories presuppose those ancient conditions, so they must have fallen away again. And so the narrative swings back and forth. And I tell you what, it's exactly like. It's the messianic secret in Mark, right? You've got two conflicting themes there. It all comes down to the evangelist or his immediate predecessor, let's not get into that, trying to work out a peace agreement, you might say, between two theological opinions here that many early Christians held that happen to be attested in the New Testament. When did Jesus become the Messiah? Did he become the Messiah, the Lord, the Son of God, only as of his resurrection? Or mustn't he have been the Messiah from birth or the baptism on? I mean, more than two views. Let's just stick with baptism. How's Mark or his predecessor going to deal with that? He'd like to combine both, and so he does. He says, Jesus was the Messiah as of the baptism and going forward. But then how could people have thought he became the Messiah on Easter? Well, suppose he had kept it a secret until Easter. Tell the vision to no man till the Son of Man be raised from them that sleep. Right? No particular reason is given for that, but it would sure help him work this model out, right? Now, Jesus is doing all kinds of miracles, which must convince everybody that this is the Messiah. So how is it people didn't know? Well, because he told them to keep quiet. and some of them must have, so that when he came out of the tomb on Easter, the most of the people didn't know what was going on. They said, hey, this guy must be the Messiah. He was put to death and he's alive again. And they simply didn't know about all the miracles he had performed during his ministry, which would have convinced them, and did convince those who knew, that he was already the Messiah. I mean, if the first time you heard of any miracles associated with Jesus was the resurrection, you would naturally infer that's when he became the Messiah. You couldn't blame him. Not stupid, right? But there were people who knew ahead of time because they were there and kept quiet as Jesus requested. The demons were trying to blab the secret of the synagogues. Hey, I know who you are. You're not fooling anyone. You're the Holy One of God, etc. Hey, quiet. Zip your lip, Satan. And that's, again, to keep it from slipping out. He is the Messianic Son of God, but he doesn't want anybody to know yet. Why that is a little tough to figure out. I guess there were theories, but it comes from this attempt to follow two incompatible views at the same time. And that's exactly what's going on in the Deuteronomic history and chronicles. And that's why you have this ridiculous spectacle of Israel and its kings swinging back and forth like a pendulum. Hope that makes some sense. Great question, very observant. Merlin Berry he lives, I think, in Virginia now, but a native of Hyde County, North Carolina, once sort of a neighbor. On your latest Geek and times before, you've said that archaeological evidence finds no migration to match the Exodus story with its myriad numbers of people, perhaps exaggerated. Does the evidence show any movements at all in the Sinai? I would be surprised if no groups had ever moved around in that or any other part of the earth except perhaps Antarctica. I'm sorry, let me read that. I would be surprised if no groups had ever moved around in that or any other part of the earth except perhaps Antarctica that archaeological evidence could not divine. In fact, there are advanced techniques now that enable archaeologists to work from helicopters and use infrared technology to trace old caravan routes long out of use. And this is how, I guess 20 years or so ago, archaeologists decided that they had found Ebla, the city of, not Ebla, I'm sorry, that was earlier than that, Irem, the city of pillars, and that was mentioned in the Quran. There's some doubt as to whether it was or not. It's also known as the city of Ubar, mentioned in the Gilgamesh epic. I'm not sure it's Irem, but it doesn't matter. They found sort of a snail trail using infrared when it was not visible in ordinary light to find this camel caravan thing. And this is much less of a movement of people than what Exodus is talking about. So you can discern these things. It's just that no one has ever found any trace of anything like the Exodus movement anywhere in the Sinai. There are about 3 major proposed routes. None of them show any evidence of it. I just finished a book by Russell Gmirkin, Gmirkin, I think, called Berosus and Genesis, Manetho, and Exodus, who indicates that the Pentateuch is probably a lot later than we thought, and that it is generally not based on a lot of archaic traditions, but a lot of the major stuff comes from these 2 Hellenistic writers of the 3rd century BCE. And that the Exodus, for instance, is sort of trumped up based on some historical data reinterpreted and all that. But not only is it fiction, but there are pretty good theories as to how and why it's fiction. Thanks, Merlin. By the way, you'll be glad to know we have a new kitty in the house, and his name is Merlin. So, Henry from New Orleans. Irish monasticism and the Desert Fathers / Egyptian monasticism? What did the Irish know about Egypt and when? How did Christian monasticism spread, and what were its antecedents? See, I am not sure. This is a real tricky one because connecting the dots on this is largely theoretical. It's a very similar question to that raised in the theory that Jewish monasticism was based on Buddhism, that there was no such thing that we know of earlier than the late centuries BCE, when we know that there were Buddhist missionaries in Egypt and Syria and so forth. And suddenly then you find the Therapeutae in Egypt that Philo discusses, whose name bears a suspicious resemblance to the Theravadins, a major Buddhist sect. And Christian Lintner has just done all kinds of eye-popping, astonishing studies of parallels between Jewish, early Christian, and Buddhist terminology and conceptuality. I have a number of those in footnotes in the Human Bible, New Testament. So it's not wacky to suggest that... Now, I know there were the sons of the prophets mentioned in Kings, right? Schools of novice prophets or something, but it's very clear that they were not ascetics and celibates. Their wives and children are mentioned, for instance. So it might be based on Buddhism. Now, could that have gotten to Ireland? Yeah, I guess it could. Who knows when? There's the issue of when Christianity came to Britain at all. Was it Augustine, not St. Augustine, the earlier one, but I think a 6th century missionary named Augustine who brought Catholicism to the Irish people. But there were already native, quote-unquote, British Christians with monasteries there, some of whom refused to join the Catholic Church and claimed an alternate apostolic tradition by way of Joseph of Arimathea and the Grail and all that. Where did they get it? I mean, who knows, right? They could have gotten it from, well, they, at any event, must have gotten it from earlier Christians, but then who are we talking about? People who had been influenced by Buddhists or Essenes or whatever. I don't know, though, from Irish records what they knew about Egypt. They could easily have been influenced by them without knowing that was the ultimate origin. How does Egypt function in the Bible? Or more precisely, what did Egypt represent for the Israelites in the Old Testament and then for the early Christians in the New? How did Egyptian culture contribute or not contribute to Judaism and later to Christianity? Well, the Egyptian Empire ruled Palestine for before the ostensible time of Abraham, and plus the fact that that means there were Egyptian administrators there, but that naturally the dominant culture would rub off on the occupied culture. And part of that may account for Egyptian names like Moses and Gershom and so on. It may be that some of the tribes that confederated at Israel, which did not have a common origin despite the stories we read, one or more of these tribes may have had ancestors who had lived in Egypt, and that's been trumped up into what we read about Joseph and his brethren. But then again, there were plenty of Jews in Ptolemaic Egypt after Alexander the Great, and they would have known quite a bit about Egypt because we're talking about Hellenistic cosmopolitanism then, and there were Isis and Osiris cultists all over the Mediterranean world that were not ethnically Egyptian and so forth. Egypt sometimes seems to have been claimed, like some of the stuff with the house of Jacob and Joseph and all that may reflect, I believe Giovanni Garbini says this, it may reflect Jews in Egypt, Ptolemaic Egypt, who were trying to get along better by claiming that, well, we originally did live here. We are Egyptian natives, though our immediate ancestors may have been from elsewhere. Just like the Abraham stories may have been a way for Jews in Babylon to say, we're not strangers in a strange land. We're Babylonians too. Look, Abraham, our ancestor, was from Ur of the Chaldees. And so it's hard to know. There are different possibilities as to what Egypt meant for different Israelites and Jews. We have like this thing in Isaiah about how Egypt, the Exodus was kind of like a replay of the battle of Yahweh against Rahab, the sea monster. And that is like making the Roman Empire into the beast of the apocalypse. So it no doubt was interpreted various different ways, just as the different writers of the early church had different opinions about the Roman Empire. Was it God's guardian against chaos, or was it the empire of the Antichrist? Let's see. I'm also interested in the Coptic belief that Mary and Joseph traveled extensively in Egypt after their flight there to escape the deaths of the innocent. Yeah, that's, I think, a lot of Egyptian church mythology to try to make it. I mean, the extreme example of that kind of legend mongering was the notion that the Queen of Sheba had a son with Solomon, Menelik the First, who became the emperor of Ethiopia, and that he managed to sneak the Ark of the Covenant back to Ethiopia, where it resides to this day. Well, no, it doesn't. But this sounds, or like Joseph of Arimathea brought Christianity in the apostolic days to Britain and so on. It just seems like it's a tendency to give yourself an apostolic pedigree and the same, Jesus slept here and that kind of thing. I wonder just how strong a force Egyptian culture was on the ancient Near East, considering how prolonged that empire, or series of dynasties and empires, was, and I find it strange that the Jewish religion, via the spread of Christianity, was the dominant religion out of the Middle East, and not some modified form of the Egyptian religion. Now that's especially interesting, but what you are imagining did happen, right, in the Hellenized version of the archaic religion of Osiris and Isis. That's the resurrection of Osiris is on the pyramid texts way back in remote antiquity, but Greeks and others were being initiated into the Isis and Osiris cult, and later the Serapis cult, which was a kind of an Hellenistic Egyptian modification of Egyptian religion. So it did actually become huge in the wider Mediterranean world. It's just that in later centuries, Judeo-Christianity kind of took over from it. But your historical instinct is quite sound. Let's see, one more from Wayne. He says, I hope your day's going well. You bet it is. Thank you so much for your work on the Human Bible and the Bible Geek. I listen to your lectures on a loop while working out. It takes more than a few passes to pick up all the information. You might also try them if you've got insomnia. That might help. I was wondering if you could discuss the theology of Zoroastrianism, in particular the aspects that influenced Abrahamic faiths. It seems to me that its prominence was quite substantial and lasting. Yeah, Wayne, somebody asked about the evidence for Zoroastrian influence, and the other day, and I can't believe I forgot a real good book on that. And other things related to it is Norman Cohn, Cohn. What's the title? I got it right over there. Cosmos and Chaos. And I think Yale University Press put it out in the 90s. He has chapters devoted to the cosmogony, the creation pictures of various Middle Eastern religions, and shows both the continuity and the distinctiveness of Zoroastrianism, how it, which then passed on into Judaism and then to Christianity and then to Islam. And that's a very good one. Norman Cohn, Cosmos and Chaos, etc., etc. Now, what are these aspects? Well, the one that he's concerned with, and it is maybe the major one, is the idea of a linear progression of history through certain predefined epochs in which certain things were going to happen. And it starts with the cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord or lord of light, pitched against his counterpart Ahriman or Angra-Mainyu, the Lord of Darkness. And they prepare for war for, I think, 3,000 years and duke it out. And they're equal in power, but not in wisdom, which kind of determines the outcome. Eventually, Ahura Mazda must win. But in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of problems because this was dualistic. Right? They didn't believe in an omnipotent God. Ahriman was independently powerful. So there was a real slugfest, a real back-and-forth war going on through most of 12,000 years of history, which were all neatly mapped out. And this seems to be the origin of apocalypticism, which is extremely big in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and you find some of it in Hinduism and Buddhism too, different messianic groups. But the idea of a kind of dispensationalism, this is the schedule of history. That was key to it. It would conclude with the victory of good over evil, the reduction of Ahriman to mere and pure potentiality and not really existing anymore. And it would also culminate in a resurrection of the dead for judgment, where the dead would walk over the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator over a huge cavern, and the wicked would fall down into the great pit, into hell, the house of the lie, and the righteous would go on into the joy of their Lord, and so on. But through an attendant bath in a flood of molten lead, all beings would be purified. The righteous would be like a bath in warm milk. They got nothing to fear. There's nothing left that needs to be purified. The wicked, there's plenty there, and so it's going to be torment, but they'll come out on the other side, a bit thinner, presumably. And if somebody is completely wicked, like certain figures we could all name, that's the end of them. It's like the old Ren and Stimpy show, where somebody came up with a gizmo to divide any person into two, the good version and the bad version, like Jekyll and Hyde. But when they put Ren Hoek, the evil chihuahua, in there were two that came out. One was the bad Ren, and the other one was the mediocre Ren. There was no good one. So, Ren Hoek would have some trouble on the day of judgment. Now, who would bring this about? The Seoshyant, the messianic benefactor, which is what that means. He would be a remote descendant of the prophet Zoroaster, who brought this truth to the world. And he had preached the true doctrine after after an immersion in a sacred river. His father was a Vedic priest, and when he came up out of the waters, the angel Vohumana appeared to him and commissioned him to take the word of Ahura Mazda to the polytheists and tell them not to worship these other gods. They were just deceiving demons, and that Ahura Mazda alone should be worshipped. And so he did, and Ahriman immediately appeared to him to tempt him to give up this mission, but he wouldn't do it. Sound familiar? And so he preaches this, and there are various other biblical parallels with this. But he is put to death while offering sacrifice in a temple after the local Persian king had adopted the new faith and given him a position of authority there. He was martyred. But there was a hidden mountain lake that functioned as a kind of a sperm bank where the seed of Zoroaster continued alive age after age until a virgin should bathe in it and become unwittingly impregnated. And that happened, and the virgin-born savior that resulted was the Saoshyans, who raises the dead and so on. Well, a lot of this, which seems to have been absent before the Babylonian exile, suddenly pops up in the very late Old Testament books and in Judaism thereafter. And it looks like the Jewish scribes and priests who were carried away in the exile began to hear this stuff and think, well, this isn't really incompatible with what we believe. It kind of solves some problems, in fact. Like theodicy, getting God off the hook for the evil in the world. Why doesn't he stop it? Well, Zoroastrian dualism said he would if he could, and eventually he will. But it's pretty obvious a lot of, let's say his will is not being done on earth as it is in heaven. Why is that? It's a tough pill to swallow to say that God would like to defeat all the evil, but he can't do it. Oh boy. But is it better to say that he could do it but won't? Don't think so. Well, Judaism adopted the Ahriman thing by reinterpreting Satan as Ahriman. But they couldn't go with total dualism because at the same time they're moving toward monotheism from polytheism. So they said, well, okay, how about this? Our Ahriman is not an anti-God, but a created being who fell. Well, that kind of ruins the idea, right? Because why did God let that happen? But at least they made a sort of a half-baked attempt to borrow the Ahriman idea. And, of course, it's also possible that this Persianized Judaism was imposed on them by their Persian overlords. I tend to think that's what happened. But at any rate, the Jews that believed in this, their doctrines were so unusual and unheard of that their detractors began to call them the Parsees, the Pharisees, right? Persians. You guys aren't real Jews. You're Zoroastrians. You're Parsees, Pharisees. Well, they couldn't shake that nickname, so they eventually said, well, all right, we'll take it, but it really comes from Perushim, the separated ones, like the Puritans, basically. But that's what I think based on the theory of T.W. Manson and others. So, there was loads of Persian Zoroastrian influence on Judaism. Okay, I think I'm going to call it quits for today. But I hope to be back with you tomorrow on another exciting episode of The Bible Geek. Thanks for listening, and if you can contribute to the upkeep of the Price estate here, sure would appreciate it. If not, don't worry. If you can contribute to the medical fund for my dear friend Acharya S., Dorothy Murdoch, she's really been hit by cancer, and if there's any way to, if you go on her website, you can contribute. If you can help her out, that's certainly far more important than any difficulty I have. So again, I'll see you tomorrow.